Chapter 1: The Man Who Counts Everything. Tony Royce trusted numbers more than people. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't betray you, didn't wake up one morning and decide loyalty had an expiration date. Numbers behaved. Numbers obeyed rules. People didn't. Tony leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the columns on his monitor. Income streams. Shell companies. Transfers routed through 3 continents before landing where they were supposed to. Every digit aligned perfectly. Good. His client tonight was one of the smaller mafia crews, but they paid well for discretion. They all did. Mafia, Russian syndicates, triads, even a Yakuza branch once. Tony didn't discriminate. Crime was universal and money was a language everyone spoke. He clicked save, then powered down his laptop. Silence filled his apartment, the comfortable kind he preferred. Being deaf meant the world was always quiet, but there were different types of silence. Some were peaceful. Some were dangerous. Tonight felt off. Tony stood, moving toward the window. 6th floor. Fire escape accessible. 2 exit routes mapped in his head automatically. He always mapped exits. Survival habit. At 35, he'd been living like this for nearly 2 decades. Since 18, when someone noticed the kid with a high school diploma could calculate laundering chains faster than college graduates. Since he said yes, he flexed his fingers. Faint tremor. He ignored it. He wasn't afraid. He was cautious. There was a difference. The tavern sat 3 blocks from his apartment. Old brick. Low lights. Sticky floors. Familiar faces. Neutral ground. No deals. No violence. No territory disputes. Everyone respected that rule. Tony pushed the door open, cool night air brushing his face before warmth replaced it. He scanned automatically exits, people, posture, tension. Then his eyes landed on the bartender. New, tall, broad shoulders, dark blonde hair, clean posture, too clean. His movements were controlled, efficient. Not the sloppy confidence of career bartenders. Tony's suspicions sparked immediately. Cop. Or military. Maybe federal. The man looked up and caught Tony staring. Their eyes locked. Blue. Sharp. Assessing. The bartender gave a small, polite smile and gestured a greeting. Tony didn't smile back. Instead, he approached the counter, watching carefully. The man grabbed a glass, poured whiskey without asking. Tony's usual order. Interesting. Tony raised an eyebrow. The bartender spoke. Lips moving clearly enough for Tony to read. On the house. New customer appreciation. Tony understood every word. He didn't react. Instead, he signed slowly, deliberately. Why are you here? The bartender froze. Just for half a second. But Tony saw it. Then the man blinked, confused. Sorry? Didn't know sign language. Or pretending. Tony took the glass, nodded once in thanks, and walked to his usual table. He could feel the bartender watching him. Good. Let him watch. Tony watched back. Peter Stewart had trained for years to control his reactions. Tonight nearly broke that training. The target he'd been tracking for months, the mysterious financial ghost serving half the organized crime networks in New York, was supposed to be invisible, untraceable, untouchable. And yet the man had just walked into Peter's bar. Like fate dropped him there. Tony Royce. Except the bureau didn't even know his name yet. Only a pattern. A ghost accountant. Peter wiped the counter slowly, pretending calm. The man moved differently from criminals Peter knew. Alert. Precise. Controlled. Dangerous but not violent. And when he signed earlier, Peter's chest tightened. Deaf. That changed things. Complicated things. Humanized things. Peter didn't like that. He was supposed to observe, not feel. But watching Tony sit alone, posture tense even while drinking, Peter felt something unfamiliar stir. Protective instinct. Which was ridiculous. Tony Royce worked for criminals. Peter's job was to bring down everyone connected to them, including him. Across the room, Tony lifted his glass again. But his eyes stayed on the bartender. Cop. Definitely a cop. Or something worse. And if that was true, Tony's life just became more dangerous. Because men like that didn't appear by accident. Chapter 2, Suspicion and Signals. Tony didn't believe in coincidences. Not when you lived in his world. The new bartender was one thing. A stranger appearing in his routine space. That happened sometimes. But the way the man moved, posture straight, shoulders balanced, eyes always scanning, that wasn't hospitality training. That was tactical awareness. Tony had seen it before. Hitmen, soldiers, federal agents. Which category the bartender belonged to, he didn't know yet, but he intended to find out. The following night, Tony returned to the tavern. Same time, same seat. Consistency was both shield and weapon. The bartender noticed him immediately. Tony could tell by the subtle shift in his stance. Attention redirected without looking obvious. Tony ordered differently this time. He approached the counter and signed again. Beer. Whatever's cheapest. The bartender stared, clearly lost. Good. Tony pulled out his phone, opened a text-to-speech app, and typed quickly. Cheapest beer you have. The robotic voice spoke the sentence aloud. The bartender blinked in surprise, then nodded. Got it. Tony watched carefully as the man grabbed a bottle. No hesitation. No awkwardness. Comfortable adapting. Interesting. Most people fumbled when communicating with deaf customers. This man adjusted immediately. Tony accepted the beer and typed again. You're new. The app spoke. Yeah, the bartender said. Just started last week. Tony studied his lips. No obvious lie. But trained people didn't show lies easily. Tony typed again. Why here? The bartender gave a small shrug. Needed a job. Tony held his gaze longer than socially comfortable. The man didn't flinch. Definitely trained. Tony nodded once and walked away. Peter forced himself to breathe normally. Every interaction with Tony felt like a chess match where he didn't know all the rules yet. The phone app caught him off guard, but it also helped. Communication meant opportunity, connection, information. And yet, he wasn't treating Tony like a target anymore. That was a problem. After his shift, Peter sat in his car with his phone open. Search history. How to communicate with deaf person. Basic ASL phrases. Deaf culture etiquette. Videos played silently while he practiced hand shapes in the dim glow of the dashboard light. Hello. Thank you. My name is Peter. His fingers felt clumsy, but he kept trying. Because something about Tony's eyes earlier, sharp, guarded, lonely, stayed with him. This was getting personal. He needed to be careful. Tony noticed him the second he stepped outside. Footsteps behind him. Close. Too close. Tony's body reacted before his thoughts did. He turned sharply, hand already inside his jacket. Gun grip. The bartender froze instantly, both hands rising. Peace gesture. Smart. Tony's eyes narrowed. The man spoke, lips moving clearly. Hey, wait. Sorry. I just wanted to ask if you dropped this. He held up a pen. Tony checked his pocket. Empty. He had dropped it. Tony didn't relax completely, but his hand eased off the weapon. He pulled out his phone again and typed. Don't walk behind me. The robotic voice delivered the message flatly. The bartender nodded quickly. Got it. Sorry. Tony studied him. Fear response looked real. Heart rate elevated. Tony could see the pulse in his neck. But there was something else. Concern. Not suspicion. Not judgment. Concern. That confused Tony more than anything. He typed again. Thank you. Then hesitated. Added another line. Tony. The bartender's expression softened slightly. Peter. Tony nodded once and turned to leave. But he could feel Peter watching him walk away. 3 blocks later, Tony's phone buzzed. Encrypted message. Client, Romano crew. Urgent. Need you tonight. Tony's stomach tightened. Urgent from criminals rarely meant good news. He stared at the message for a long moment, then glanced back down the street. Peter was still visible near the tavern entrance. Watching. Tony made a decision he didn't fully understand yet. Things went wrong. That man might be useful. Or dangerous. Maybe both. Chapter 3 Blood in the Ledger. Tony knew the moment he arrived that something was wrong. The Romano Cruz warehouse usually had a predictable rhythm. Guards outside, casual arrogance, loose posture. Criminals who believed they were safe. Tonight, the air felt sharp, tense. Men stood too straight. Hands hovered too close to weapons. Eyes tracked him like he was prey instead of a contractor. Tony stopped 3 steps inside the door. Exit points, 2 behind him, 1 loading dock to the right, stairs to an office above. 6 armed men visible, probably more hidden. His instincts screamed, trap. But running immediately would confirm guilt. And Tony had learned long ago that sometimes survival meant walking deeper into danger before escaping it. Marco Romano approached from the office stairs. Mid-40s. Expensive suit. Permanent scowl. Tony had worked for him 3 years. Never a problem. Until now. Marco spoke sharply. You stole from me. Tony didn't react outwardly. Inside, everything went cold. No confusion. No panic. Just calculation. Tony pulled out his phone calmly and opened his communication app. I don't steal from clients. The robotic voice echoed across the warehouse. Marco laughed, harsh and humorless. 5 million missing. Routed through accounts only you control. Tony's brain moved instantly. 5 million. That wasn't theft. That was framing. Someone inside the organization manipulated transactions to point at him. Tony typed again. Show me the records. Marco's expression darkened. You think I'm stupid? Gun barrels lifted. Tony counted. 8 now. Distance to loading dock, 12 meters. Probability of clean escape, low. But not 0. Tony typed again. I fix problems. Killing me won't recover your money. Marco stepped closer, rage radiating off him. You were always too clean. Too perfect. I should have known. Tony's pulse slowed. Adrenaline settling into focus. This was happening. Marco pulled his gun. Tony moved first. The first shot wasn't his. One of Marco's men fired sloppy, emotional. Tony dropped sideways behind a crate as the bullet shattered wood where his head had been. He drew his pistol smoothly. Tony hated hand-to-hand combat. But guns? Guns were numbers. Angles. Timing. Probability. Predictable. He fired twice. 1 man down. Second shot, shoulder hit on another. Chaos exploded through the warehouse. Tony rolled, using cover, calculating movement paths automatically. He wasn't trying to kill everyone, just create space. Escape vector. He sprinted toward the loading dock. Pain exploded across his side. He stumbled. Shot. Not deep, but bleeding. He gritted his teeth and kept moving. Another guard appeared near the exit. Tony fired once. Center mass. The man dropped. Tony slammed through the loading door into the cold night air. Behind him, shouting. More gunfire. But Tony was already running. 3 blocks later, his vision blurred slightly. Blood loss. Not critical yet. But he needed treatment soon. Safe houses? Compromised. Clients? Untrustworthy now. Anyone connected to the underworld could sell him out. Tony leaned against a brick wall, breathing hard. For the first time in years, he had nowhere safe to go. Then one thought surfaced. Peter, the bartender. Possible cop. Possible enemy. But also, outside the criminal network. Tony almost laughed. Trusting a suspected federal agent might be the safest option he had. Which said a lot about how bad things were. He forced himself upright and started walking. Peter was closing the bar when the door slammed open. He turned, instinctively alert. Tony stood there, pale, blood soaking through his shirt, gun still in his hand. Peter's training kicked in immediately. Jesus! Tony staggered. Peter caught him before he hit the floor. Up close, Tony's face was tight with pain, but his eyes were still sharp, still calculating, still dangerous. Tony grabbed Peter's shirt weakly and shoved his phone toward him. Text already typed. I need help. Please. Peter didn't hesitate. Okay. I've got you. And the moment the words left his mouth, Peter knew everything had just changed. Chapter 4, Safe House Lies. Peter's apartment was 3 flights up with no elevator. Under normal circumstances, He would have worried about neighbors seeing the blood. Tonight, survival came first. Tony was half-conscious by the time they reached the door, his weight heavy against Peter's shoulder. For someone lean, he was solid muscle built from tension rather than gym time. Peter fumbled his keys, shoved the door open, and guided Tony inside. "Stay with me," he muttered automatically. Even though he knew Tony couldn't hear him, Tony's grip tightened weakly on his shirt. "Awake enough. Good." Peter lowered him onto the couch and immediately assessed the wound. Entry on the left side, just below the ribs. No obvious exit. Not ideal. But the bleeding wasn't arterial. "Okay," Peter said, forcing calm into his voice. "I'm going to help you." Tony's eyes locked onto his face, searching, evaluating. Even injured, he was assessing threat levels. Peter held up his hands slowly, palms visible, a universal gesture of safety. Tony nodded once. Permission granted. Cleaning a bullet wound in your living room wasn't part of Peter's official FBI training manual. But field work came with overlap, tactical medicine, emergency stabilization, improvisation. He cut the shirt away carefully. Tony flinched but didn't make a sound. That silence hit Peter harder than he expected. No cries of pain. No groans. Just tight breathing and clenched jaw. Peter worked quickly, disinfecting the area. "We might have to leave the bullet in for now," he said, knowing Tony was reading his lips. "Hospital isn't safe, right?" Tony shook his head immediately. "Yeah." That confirmed things. Peter numbed the area as best he could with supplies from his emergency kit. Tony's eyes narrowed. Suspicion. Of course. Bartenders didn't usually own trauma kits. Tony grabbed his wrist suddenly. Strong despite blood loss. Peter froze. Tony reached for his phone on the table with his other hand and typed. "You're not just a bartender." Peter exhaled slowly. "Lie carefully." "I was military," he said. "Medic training." Not entirely false. Tony studied his face for several seconds. Long enough that Peter wondered if he'd been caught. Then Tony released him. Small nod. Temporary acceptance. The procedure took 20 minutes. Peter cleaned, dressed, and bandaged the wound securely. Tony's breathing finally eased once the bleeding slowed. Color returning slightly. Peter sat back on his heels. "You're going to be okay," he said softly. Tony watched his lips, then reached for his phone again. "Thank you." Peter felt something twist in his chest. "No problem." Tony hesitated, then typed more. "I will leave when I can walk." The statement wasn't rude. It was defensive. Boundary setting. Peter understood. "You can stay until you're healed," he said. "No pressure." Tony's eyes widened slightly. Surprise. Probably not used to unconditional offers. He typed again. "Dangerous to know me." Peter almost laughed. "Yeah," he said. "I figured that out when you walked in bleeding with a gun." For the first time, Tony's mouth curved faintly. A small smile. It hit Peter harder than any punch. Later, after Tony fell asleep on the couch, Peter sat at his kitchen table staring at his laptop. Case files open. Financial ghost. Unknown accountant servicing multiple crime families. Now bleeding on his couch. If he called this in, the bureau would swarm. Tony would be arrested, interrogated, used, and Peter's investigation into the bigger organization might collapse before reaching the real targets. But that wasn't the real reason he hesitated. The real reason was simpler. Tony trusted him, at least a little, and Peter didn't want to break that, which was a dangerous feeling for an undercover agent. Around 3 a.m., Tony woke suddenly, disoriented for half a second. Then memory returned. Unknown apartment. Possible cop nearby. He reached instinctively toward his sidearm. Still holstered on the coffee table. Untouched. Tony looked up. Peter was asleep in a chair across the room. Neck bent awkwardly. Clearly uncomfortable. Tony stared at him for a long moment. No one had ever stayed nearby while he slept. Not since he was a child. Something unfamiliar settled in his chest. Not trust. Not yet. But something close. Chapter 5 Lines You Shouldn't Cross. By the second day, Tony could walk without swaying. By the third, he could almost pretend nothing had happened. Except everything had. Peter's apartment smelled like coffee and laundry detergent. Clean, ordinary since Tony wasn't used to associating with safety. He sat at the small kitchen table while Peter cooked eggs on the stove. Movements efficient but relaxed. Domestic. Normal. Dangerous. Tony watched carefully. Peter moved like someone trained. Balanced stance. Situational awareness even while doing mundane tasks. Definitely not just a bartender. The military medic explanation made sense on the surface, but Tony's instincts still itched. Instincts had kept him alive since he was 18. He didn't ignore them. Peter turned and caught him watching. Instead of speaking immediately, Peter hesitated, then lifted his hands. Awkwardly, clumsily, but unmistakably sign. Good morning. Tony blinked. Surprise hit him so hard he almost laughed. Peter winced slightly, clearly unsure if he'd done it right. Tony spoke aloud, voice rough from disuse but clear. Your hand shape is wrong. Peter's eyes widened. It was the first time he'd heard Tony's voice. Tony rarely spoke with hearing people. The effort of monitoring volume and pronunciation wasn't worth it when a phone app worked faster. But he wasn't mute. His vocal cords functioned fine. Peter recovered quickly. Okay, he said, smiling a little. That's fair. Tony reached over and adjusted Peter's fingers into the correct position. Like this, he said. Peter watched intently. Close. Too close. Tony noticed the warmth of his skin, the steadiness of his breathing. He pulled his hand back first. Distance. Necessary. Peter tried again. Good morning, Tony. The grammar was off. The movement stiff. But the effort. Tony felt something loosen in his chest. He nodded once. Better. Peter grinned, genuine, unguarded pride. It was disarming. Over the next 2 days, a routine formed. Peter worked nights at the bar. Tony stayed inside, using Peter's laptop to monitor financial networks and quietly reroute some of his own assets. No one knew Tony Royce was a millionaire. Not the gangs. Not the government. Not even Peter. Tony kept it that way intentionally. Money was freedom, and anonymity protected that freedom. But now, he was considering disappearing. New identity. New country. Leave the underworld completely. The idea both relieved and terrified him. Because leaving meant cutting every connection, including the one forming here. On the 4th evening, Peter came home with takeout and a bruise forming along his jaw. Tony noticed immediately. He pointed. What happened? Peter shrugged. Bar fight. Broke it up. Tony didn't believe him. Too clean of an injury. Too controlled. He grabbed his phone and typed. You fight like trained. The robotic voice spoke. Peter sighed. Military, he repeated. Tony studied him for several seconds, then nodded slowly. Temporary acceptance again. But the suspicion remained. Later that night, Tony's encrypted phone buzzed. Unknown number. Message. We know you're alive. Return the money or you die. Romano crew. Tony's stomach tightened. They were escalating. Which meant they hadn't found the real thief yet. Which meant Tony was still the scapegoat. Peter noticed his expression change. Concern immediately on his face. You okay? Tony hesitated. Trust was dangerous. Connection was dangerous. But hiding everything might get Peter killed too. Tony typed slowly. People who shot me. They think I stole from them. Peter's posture shifted subtly. Alert. How dangerous? Tony met his eyes. Very. Peter nodded once. No fear. Just acceptance. I figured. That simple response hit Tony harder than any dramatic reaction could have. No judgment. No panic. Just staying. Tony realized something then. He wanted Peter alive. Which meant he needed to make decisions fast. That night, Tony lay awake on the couch staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he imagined a future that didn't involve crime. Didn't involve constant exits and contingency plans. A future that might include someone else. Peter. The thought was terrifying. And tempting. Chapter 6. The Truth Between Us. Tony noticed the car the moment they turned onto Peter Street. Black sedan. Engine running. 2 silhouettes inside. Not neighbors. Not random. Watching. His pulse slowed, the way it always did when danger appeared. Adrenaline didn't make him panic. It made him precise. He grabbed Peter's sleeve before they reached the apartment entrance. Peter followed his gaze instantly. Training. Confirmed again. Tony signed sharply. Car. Watching. Danger. Peter understood enough to tense, even if he didn't catch every sign. His eyes flicked back to Tony's face for confirmation. Tony nodded once. Yes. Threat. Peter's posture changed immediately, shoulders lowering, center of gravity shifting. Combat ready. Definitely not just military medic. They kept walking. Casual. Normal. Tony's right hand slipped inside his jacket. Gun grip. 3 steps from the door, the sedan doors opened. 2 men got out. Tony recognized one immediately. Romano crew. So they'd found him. That was fast. Tony! The man shouted. Tony couldn't hear the sound, but he saw the mouth forming his name. Peter moved slightly in front of him. Protective instinct. Unexpected. Stupid. Tony grabbed Peter's arm and pulled him back. No. Gun came up. The first attacker reached inside his coat. Tony fired first. 1 shot. Center mass. The man dropped. Second attacker pulled his weapon. Peter moved. Fast. Cleaner than Tony expected. Peter slammed the attacker into the car door, disarming him with practiced efficiency. A sharp elbow. A twist. The gun clattered to the pavement. Law enforcement training. No doubt now. Peter punched once, controlled force, and the man collapsed unconscious. Silence followed. Tony's chest rose and fell slowly. Peter turned toward him, breathing hard. You okay? Tony stared at him. Really stared. Everything clicked into place. The posture. The awareness. The skills. The lies. Tony's jaw tightened. He signed slowly. You are police. Peter froze. Tony already had his phone out. Typing. You are law enforcement. Federal maybe. The robotic voice filled the space between them. Peter didn't answer immediately. That hesitation was answer enough. Tony's chest hurt, not from the gunshot wound. From something else. Betrayal. He spoke aloud. Words shaped imperfectly. Voice carrying the distinct deaf accent of someone who'd never heard speech clearly. You lie. To me. The consonants were soft, vowels slightly off, rhythm uneven. But the meaning was unmistakable. Peter's expression cracked. Tony. Tony stepped back. Distance. Safety. His hands shook. Anger, adrenaline, fear mixing together. You watch me, Tony said. From start. Peter swallowed. Yes. The honesty hit harder than another lie would have. Tony laughed once, bitter. Of course. He turned away, pacing once, trying to stabilize his thoughts. Trust no one. Rule number 1. He broke it. Again. When he faced Peter, his eyes were sharp again, walls rebuilding. You arrest me? He asked. Peter shook his head immediately. No. Tony searched his face for deception. Didn't find any. Confusing. Why? Tony asked. Peter stepped closer. Slowly, like approaching a frightened animal. Because you're not the enemy, he said. Tony's chest tightened. Dangerous words. Peter continued, voice quieter. I was investigating the organization you work for. You were supposed to be a lead. But then I met you and... You're not what I expected. Tony's throat felt tight. Emotions were messy. Unpredictable. He hated that. Peter stopped an arm's length away. Close enough that Tony could feel body heat. Tony, Peter said softly, making sure his lips were clear to read. I don't want to hurt you. The sincerity in his face was overwhelming. Tony's heart pounded. Too fast. Too loud, even in silence. Peter's eyes dropped briefly to Tony's mouth. Tony noticed. Electric tension snapped between them. For one reckless second, Tony thought Peter might kiss him. He didn't. Instead, Peter stepped back, giving space, choice, respect. That somehow felt more intimate than a kiss. Tony exhaled slowly. Everything had changed. Again. Chapter 7: Enemies and Allies. They went back inside without speaking. Peter locked the apartment door, checked the windows, then pulled the curtains closed. Tony watched every movement automatically, noting the efficiency, the order. Federal agent. No doubt anymore. Oddly. The confirmation brought relief along with the anger. At least the uncertainty was gone. Peter turned to face him. "I'm FBI," he said, making sure his lips were easy to read. "Undercover. Organized Crime Task Force." Tony crossed his arms. Expected. Still hurt. Peter continued carefully. "My original target wasn't you. It was the network above the families, the financial pipeline connecting them." Tony's eyebrows lifted slightly. That was big. Few people even knew that network existed. Peter saw the reaction. "Yeah," he said. "You know what I'm talking about." Tony hesitated, then nodded once. He pulled out his phone and typed. "I suspected something bigger for years." The robotic voice spoke. Peter stepped closer. "Tony, why are you working for them?" Simple question. Complicated answer. Tony stared at the floor for a moment, then forced himself to speak. Words came slowly, shaped imperfectly. "I was 18, he said. "Good with numbers. Someone see. Offer money. I say yes." He shrugged faintly. Then, "Cannot leave." Peter's expression softened. Tony continued, voice quieter. "My parents die when I was 4. Gang fight. Wrong place." Peter's chest tightened visibly. Tony didn't usually share that. He didn't know why he was now. Maybe because Peter already saw him at his weakest, bleeding, vulnerable. Maybe because part of him wanted Peter to understand. "I survive," Tony said simply. Peter nodded slowly. "You did more than survive," he said. "You built something." Tony almost smiled. If Peter only knew how much. But Tony wasn't ready to reveal the extent of his wealth. Not yet. They sat at the kitchen table. Opposite sides. Like negotiations. Which, in a way, this was. Peter leaned forward. "The Romano crew isn't the real problem," he said. "They're mid-level. Replaceable. But the people above them, the ones moving billions, that's who I'm after." Tony nodded. He knew exactly who Peter meant. Shadow financiers. Untouchable. Until now. Tony typed. "You want my help?" Peter didn't deny it. "Yes." Tony studied him carefully. Helping the FBI meant burning every bridge to the underworld permanently. No going back. No safety net. But staying meant constant danger anyway. Romano wanted him dead. Others might follow once rumors spread. Tony exhaled slowly. "I want out," he said. The admission felt heavier than any confession. Peter's eyes widened slightly. "Out of the life?" Tony nodded. "Yes." Peter didn't hesitate. "Then I'll help you." Tony searched his face for deception. Didn't find any. Trust, fragile, uncertain, shifted slightly stronger. Over the next hour, they started planning. Tony explained financial structures using a mix of speech, signing, and his phone app when clarity mattered. Peter listened intensely, occasionally asking questions. At one point, Peter tried signing again. "We work together." The grammar was rough. Movement still stiff. But understandable. Tony felt warmth spread through his chest. He corrected gently, adjusting Peter's hand position. "Like this," he said. Peter repeated it. "Better. Progress. Connection." Later, while reviewing names on Tony's laptop, Peter spoke quietly. "When this is over, what do you want?" Tony froze. No one had asked him that in years. Maybe ever. He thought carefully, then answered honestly. "Safe," he said. A pause. Then softer. "Free." Peter nodded. "I can do that." The certainty in his voice was terrifying. Because Tony wanted to believe him. That night, Tony realized something important. Peter wasn't just an ally anymore. He was becoming necessary. Which was dangerous in its own way. Chapter 8: Close Enough to Break. The safe location was not official FBI property. That told Tony everything he needed to know. Peter parked outside a small, Aging cabin 2 hours north of the city. Surrounded by bare winter trees and silence, so complete it almost felt familiar. No neighbors. No street traffic. No easy surveillance angles. Off-grid. Unofficial. Risky. You trust this place? Tony asked, voice uneven but understandable despite the deaf accent shaping his words. Peter nodded. Belongs to a friend who owes me a favor. No records tied to the bureau. Tony approved immediately. No paper trail meant survival. They entered carefully, Peter first, clearing rooms with practiced precision. Tony watched, arms folded, confirmation stacking higher in his mind. FBI training went far beyond what Peter had admitted casually. The cabin was small. 1 bedroom, 1 couch, compact kitchen. Tony raised an eyebrow. Peter rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah. Didn't plan that part. Tony almost smiled. An hour later, laptops covered the kitchen table. Tony worked while Peter watched, occasionally asking questions. Columns of accounts scrolled across the screen. Shell corporations layered like Russian dolls. Tony's fingers moved quickly. Numbers calmed him. Numbers made sense when emotions didn't. Peter leaned closer. You've been managing all this alone? Tony nodded. Yes. Peter shook his head softly. That's billions moving through here. Tony hesitated, then made a decision. He typed into his phone. I also saved money. Personal accounts. Hidden. The robotic voice spoke calmly. Peter frowned slightly. How much? Tony considered lying. Didn't. Enough, he said aloud. Peter laughed lightly. That's not an answer. Tony met his eyes. Enough to disappear forever. Peter's smile faded, replaced by understanding. You were planning an exit. Tony nodded once. Always plan exit. Peter studied him quietly. You never trusted anyone enough to stay. Tony didn't answer, because that had been true. Until recently. Night came quickly in the woods. No city lights. No distractions. Just quiet. Peter cooked pasta while Tony sat at the counter watching him. Domestic moments still felt unreal, like stepping briefly into someone else's life. Peter glanced back. You okay? Tony nodded. Then added carefully, speaking slower so Peter could understand clearly. I'm not used to this. To what? Tony gestured around. Peace. Peter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he set 2 plates down and signed slowly. Safe here. The movement was clumsy but recognizable. Tony felt warmth spread through him again. He corrected Peter gently, guiding his hands. Peter didn't pull away. Their hands lingered together longer than necessary. Neither moved. The air shifted. Closer. Warmer. Dangerous in a completely different way. Tony became intensely aware of Peter's proximity, the steadiness of his breathing, the way his eyes softened when focused on him. Peter spoke quietly. I meant what I said. I'll get you out of this. Tony searched his face. So, after? He asked. Peter hesitated. The question clearly caught him off guard. I don't know, Peter admitted. I haven't thought that far. Tony nodded slowly. He had. Leaving meant losing Peter. The realization hurt more than expected. Peter's gaze dropped briefly to Tony's mouth again. Tony's breath caught. He didn't step back this time. Peter moved closer. Slow enough to stop. Close enough that Tony could feel warmth against his skin. 1 more inch. Headlights flashed through the cabin window. Both men snapped into motion instantly. Tony grabbed his gun. Peter killed the lights. A vehicle approached outside. Engine low. Unfamiliar. Tony signed sharply. Not FBI. Peter nodded. Agreed. Romano, or worse. The moment shattered. Reality rushing back in. They moved into defensive positions without another word. Whatever this was between them would have to wait. Survival came first. Chapter 9. No safe places. The headlights stopped outside the cabin. Engine still running. Tony crouched beside the window, body angled carefully to avoid silhouette exposure. Peter moved near the door, gun raised, posture controlled and steady. They didn't need words. Tony counted shadows through the thin curtain. 1, 2, 3, maybe 4. Not amateurs. Spread formation. Tony signed quickly. 4. Armed. Peter nodded once. He trusted Tony's reads now. Outside, a figure approached the porch slowly, weapon low but ready. Another circled toward the side of the cabin. Flanking. Professional. Tony's stomach tightened. Romano crew didn't move this cleanly. Someone else was involved. The door handle rattled. Locked. A pause. Then the window shattered. Tony fired first. One precise shot through the broken glass. A man dropped instantly. Peter opened the door suddenly and pulled the second attacker inside, disarming him with brutal efficiency. A sharp strike to the throat followed by a controlled takedown. Tony pivoted toward the back window. Gunfire exploded through the wall. Wood splintered. Tony ducked, rolling behind the couch as bullets tore through where he'd been seconds earlier. 2 shooters outside now. Peter shouted something Tony couldn't hear, but the urgency was clear from his expression. Retreat plan. Tony nodded. Back exit. They moved together, synchronized despite never training as a team. Another attacker burst through the side door. Peter fired. Missed. The man aimed directly at Peter's chest. Tony reacted without thinking. 1 shot. Clean. The attacker collapsed inches before pulling the trigger. Peter stared at Tony briefly, realization flashing across his face. Tony had just saved his life. No time to process. More movement outside. Tony signed sharply. Go. Now. They slipped out the back, disappearing into the trees as gunfire resumed behind them. Cold air burned Tony's lungs as they ran downhill through the forest, branches snapping underfoot. After several minutes, Peter pulled them behind a fallen log, both breathing hard, listening, watching. No pursuit. For now. Peter turned toward him first. You okay? Tony nodded, then signed. You almost died. Peter huffed a breath. Yeah. Thanks to you, I didn't. Tony shrugged slightly, though adrenaline still raced through him. Saving people wasn't part of his job description. But saving Peter felt automatic. Necessary. Peter studied him carefully. That wasn't Romano, he said. Tony agreed immediately. He pulled out his phone. Too organized. Too fast. Someone gave location. Peter's jaw tightened. An FBI leak was the unspoken implication. Or someone high in the criminal network. Either option was bad. Peter ran a hand through his hair. Only a few people knew where we were. Tony's eyes narrowed. Trust was shrinking again. Danger came from every direction now. They walked for nearly an hour before reaching Peter's hidden backup vehicle parked along an old service road. Inside the car, warmth slowly returned. Silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Peter finally spoke. You saved me back there. Tony looked out the window. Simple truth. Yes. Peter laughed softly. You don't even hesitate. Tony considered that, then answered honestly. I hesitate. For most people. Peter stilled, understanding the implication. Emotion thickened the air again. Peter turned slightly toward him. Why not me? Tony's hands rested in his lap. He didn't sign, didn't type. Instead, he spoke, words imperfect but sincere. Because I trust you. The confession hung between them. Peter's expression softened completely. He reached out slowly, giving Tony time to pull away. Tony didn't. Peter's hand rested lightly against Tony's cheek. Warm, steady, safe. Tony's breath caught. No alarms in his mind. No survival instinct screaming retreat. Just quiet. Peter leaned closer. This time, Tony closed the distance first. Their kiss was careful at first, tentative testing, then deeper as weeks of tension finally broke free. Tony felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest. Hope. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Peter smiled faintly. Well, he said softly, that complicates things. Tony almost laughed. Yes, but for once, complicated didn't feel dangerous. Felt worth it. Chapter 10 Fault Lines. Morning came slowly. Tony woke first. Years of survival had trained his body to surface from sleep the moment light shifted or movement changed. Not sound, never sound, but vibration, air pressure, instinct. For a few seconds, he didn't move. Peter slept beside him in the car's reclined seat, head tilted awkwardly toward the window, exhaustion softening the sharp lines of his face. Last night replayed in Tony's mind. Gunfire. Running. The kiss. Tony exhaled quietly. Feelings complicated plans. Plans kept people alive. He needed to remember that. Still, he didn't move away. Peter woke with a start, immediately alert before recognition settled in. Tony watched the moment tension left his shoulders. "You're real," Peter murmured, then flushed slightly, realizing Tony was watching his lips closely. Tony smiled faintly. "Yes." His pronunciation carried the familiar deaf accent. Vowels rounded differently, rhythm uneven but warm. Peter didn't look confused or uncomfortable. He never did. That mattered more than Tony wanted to admit. They relocated to a roadside motel 2 towns over, anonymous, forgettable. Inside, Tony immediately set up Peter's laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. Peter leaned against the wall, watching. "You work faster than anyone I've ever seen." Tony shrugged. "Numbers, quiet," he said. "Easy." People were not. After several minutes, Tony froze, eyes narrowing. Something clicked into place. He pulled up transaction histories tied to the missing 5 million. Patterns emerged. Intentional patterns. Tony turned the screen toward Peter and typed quickly. Money wasn't stolen. It was moved to trigger investigation. Peter stepped closer. "What?" Tony pointed at layered transfers. "See," he said carefully, speech slower as he concentrated. "Trail too clean. Someone want discovery." Peter's eyes widened. "A setup." Tony nodded. "Yes. Someone inside syndicate frame me and expose network." Peter paced once, processing. "That means whoever did this wanted federal attention." Tony typed again. "Or wanted chaos inside organization." Both possibilities were terrifying. Peter stopped pacing. "If the higher network thinks you're responsible, they'll hunt you too." Tony nodded calmly. "Already understood." Danger level escalating again. Peter's phone buzzed. He stared at the screen. Tony watched his expression change. Tension returning instantly. "Bureau," Peter said quietly. "Missed calls. Multiple messages." Tony didn't need sound to understand urgency. Peter exhaled slowly. "They think I've gone dark." Tony signed carefully. "You in trouble." Peter huffed a humorless laugh. "Yeah, probably." Tony studied him. Peter was being pulled in 2 directions now. Duty. And him. Tony spoke softly. "You go back, safer." Peter shook his head immediately. "No." Tony frowned. "Your job." "My job," Peter interrupted gently, ensuring Tony could read his lips, "was to stop criminals hurting innocent people." He stepped closer. "You're trying to leave that life. I'm not handing you over just because it's convenient." Tony's chest tightened. No one had chosen him before. Not like this. Later, they sat on opposite sides of the motel bed, reviewing names connected to the financial syndicate. Tony pointed to one entry. His expression darkened. "This one," he said. Peter leaned closer. "Who is he?" Tony hesitated. Fear, rare and genuine, flickered across his face. "Accountant above me," he said quietly. "Controls oversight." Peter's stomach dropped. The real architect, which meant Tony had never been more than a piece on the board. Peter looked at him. "We take him down," he said. Tony nodded slowly, but uncertainty lingered, because taking down someone that powerful meant war. That night, exhaustion finally caught up with them. Tony lay awake longer, watching Peter sleep again. He realized something unsettling. For the first time since childhood, he felt safer with someone else nearby. And that made losing Peter a new kind of fear. Chapter 11 Pressure Points. Tony noticed the surveillance before Peter did. Not sound, never sound. Movement. Patterns. A sedan parked across the motel lot that hadn't moved in 20 minutes. 2 men inside pretending not to watch the rooms. One stepped out briefly, posture straight, scanning corners without looking obvious. Law enforcement. Tony's stomach tightened. He signed immediately. FBI. Peter looked up from his laptop, following Tony's gaze through the curtain. Yeah, he muttered. That's them. No surprise in his voice, only resignation. Tony crossed his arms. You knew they come. Peter nodded slowly. I figured going dark would force their hand. Tony studied him carefully. This wasn't panic. This was inevitability. Peter turned toward him. They're here for me, not you. They don't know you're inside. Tony didn't look convinced. Danger rarely separated itself neatly. 10 minutes later, Peter stepped outside alone. Tony stayed near the window, watching carefully. A woman exited the sedan, mid-40s, sharp posture, authority radiating from every movement. Handler. They spoke. Tony focused intensely on their lips, piecing together fragments. Compromised. Orders. Bring him in. Peter shook his head. Firm. Unyielding. The woman's expression hardened. Tony caught enough to understand. Protecting a criminal. Peter's reply came slower, deliberate. Not what you think. He's helping. The handler's mouth tightened. Career suicide. Tony's chest tightened unexpectedly. Peter was arguing. For him. Risking everything. The conversation grew more heated, gestures sharper now. Tony caught one sentence clearly from Peter. I'm not abandoning him. Something inside Tony shifted painfully. No one had ever chosen him over their own safety. Not once. Peter returned 10 minutes later, jaw tense. They're pulling me off the case, he said. Tony nodded once. Expected. You go, Tony said quietly. Peter frowned. What? You go back. Safe. Job safe. Tony's words came unevenly but determined. I disappear. Good solution. Peter stared at him. No. Tony shook his head. Yes, this life, always dangerous. You don't belong in it. Peter stepped closer. I made my choice. Tony's voice rose slightly, frustration breaking through. You lose everything. The words sounded rough, shaped imperfectly, emotion disrupting his control over pronunciation. Peter didn't flinch. I'll survive, he said softly. You might not if you face this alone. Tony looked away, because that was true, and he hated needing someone. Tony's phone buzzed. Unknown encrypted sender. He opened it. A single message appeared. We finished this tonight. Attached was a photo. Taken recently. The motel. Tony's blood ran cold. They knew. The real mastermind had entered the game. Tony showed Peter. Peter swore under his breath. They found you already. Tony nodded. Not Romano, he said. Higher. Which meant professionals. Assassins. No warnings. No negotiations. Just elimination. Peter grabbed his jacket immediately. We move now. Tony hesitated. A thought forming, cold, logical. If he surrendered himself, Peter would be safe. The FBI would stop chasing Peter. The assassins would stop targeting civilians nearby. Clean solution. Tony stepped back. Peter noticed instantly. What? Tony forced himself to speak. I go alone, he said. Peter's expression hardened. Absolutely not. Tony met his eyes. If I stay, you die too. Peter stepped forward, gripping Tony's shoulders firmly. Listen to me, he said, making sure every word was visible. We survive this together. Tony's chest tightened again. Together. Such a fragile word. But before he could respond, movement outside. 3 black SUVs pulling into the lot. Too coordinated. Too fast. Tony signed sharply. They hear. Peter turned toward the window. Game over. Time to run again. Chapter 12, Running Out of Time. Tony saw the doors open before Peter reached the window. 4 men exited the SUVs. Black suits. Coordinated spacing. Weapons concealed but ready. Professional assassins. Not intimidation. Execution. Tony grabbed his bag instantly, already moving toward the back exit. Peter followed without hesitation, pulling his gun as they stepped into the narrow exterior walkway behind the motel rooms. A flash of movement. Tony shoved Peter down just as a bullet shattered the window behind them. Glass exploded outward. Peter rolled, returning fire toward the shooter rounding the corner. Tony didn't wait. He calculated angles, timing steps between bursts of gunfire. He fired twice, controlled, efficient, forcing two attackers into cover. They ran. Down the back stairs. Across the empty lot. Another SUV screeched sideways to block their path. Too fast. Tony pivoted sharply, pulling Peter toward a maintenance alley. Gunfire echoed, vibrations through the ground. Tony felt more than heard. They ducked behind dumpsters as bullets struck metal with violent tremors. Peter glanced at him. Ideas? Tony nodded once. Always. He signed quickly. Distract. Left. Peter didn't fully understand the signs, but he trusted Tony now. He fired several shots toward the vehicle, drawing attention. Tony moved right instead. Silent. Precise. He circled behind one of the attackers, firing once at close range before grabbing the man's dropped rifle and tossing it aside. Peter seized the opening, sprinting toward a gap between buildings. They escaped into the darkness behind the motel complex just as sirens began approaching in the distance. Someone had called the police. Too late to help. Just in time to complicate things. They didn't stop running until they reached an abandoned parking structure 3 blocks away, both breathing hard. Adrenaline fading into exhaustion. Peter leaned against a concrete pillar. They're escalating fast. Tony nodded. Yes. No more denial. The mastermind wanted him erased immediately. Tony sat on the cold ground, staring at his hands for a long moment. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a small encrypted drive. Peter frowned. What's that? Tony hesitated, then decided. No more partial truths. I tell you everything now, he said. His speech was careful, shaped by effort but steady. Peter waited. Tony held up the drive. My money, he said. Peter blinked. Your savings. Tony shook his head. Not savings. A pause. Hundreds million. Silence filled the structure. Peter stared at him. You're serious? Tony nodded. Since years. I take small percent. Legal transfers. Hidden. No one know. Peter ran a hand through his hair. Stunned. You could have disappeared any time. Tony's expression softened slightly. Yes. Peter's voice lowered. Why didn't you? Tony looked at him directly. Because the truth mattered now. I was alone, he said simply. The words landed heavily between them. Peter stepped closer. And now? Tony hesitated only a second. Not anymore. Peter's chest tightened. All the walls Tony built, decades strong, were lowering piece by piece. Peter reached for his hand. Tony let him. Warm fingers laced together. Steady. Real. Peter spoke quietly. Then we finish this. One last move. Tony nodded. He plugged the drive into the laptop and pulled up files, transaction histories, identities, offshore holdings. Evidence powerful enough to destroy the entire syndicate, including the mastermind. Tony signed slowly while speaking. We expose everything. Public. Peter understood immediately. No quiet arrest, he said. No cover-ups. Tony nodded. Light, safest weapon. Public exposure meant no secret retaliation. Too many eyes watching. It was risky, but it was their best chance to survive. Peter squeezed his hand gently. We do it together. Tony felt something settle inside him. Not fear. Not survival instinct. Something stronger. Hope. Chapter 13, the final account. The plan relied on timing. Timing and trust. Tony sat in the passenger seat while Peter drove toward Manhattan just before dawn. City lights bleeding into the gray horizon. Traffic was light, which made them more visible but faster. Speed mattered now. Tony's laptop rested on his knees. Encrypted drive connected. Multiple progress bars running simultaneously. Uploading. Duplicating. Sending fragments of evidence to journalists, watchdog organizations, and independent servers across multiple countries. No single shutdown could stop it. Peter glanced over. How long? Tony held up 3 fingers. Minutes. His voice carried strain, not from fear, but concentration. Every transfer required precision. One mistake could expose locations or allow interception. Peter's phone buzzed again. Ignored. Tony noticed. FBI? He asked. Peter nodded. They're ordering me to stand down. Tony studied him carefully. You should answer. Peter shook his head. Not until this is done. Tony didn't argue, but he understood what that meant. Peter was choosing him again. They parked near an old financial district building. Public Wi-Fi hub, dense signal traffic, impossible to isolate quickly. Tony moved fast despite lingering pain from his injury, setting up inside a small cafe just opening for morning customers. Normal environment. Best cover. Peter sat across from him, watching entrances while pretending to scroll his phone. Tony's fingers flew across the keyboard. Upload. 47%. His phone vibrated. Unknown encrypted message. He opened it. A single line appeared. You always were the smart one, Tony. Tony froze. The sender ID resolved automatically. Name appearing on screen. Victor Hale. Tony's breath caught. Peter noticed immediately. What? Tony turned the laptop toward him, then spoke carefully. My supervisor, he said. Above all accountants. Peter's stomach dropped. The mastermind. Not a distant executive. Someone Tony had worked under for years. Tony typed quickly, sending the identity into the outgoing evidence files. No hesitation. Upload. 63%. Peter leaned closer. If he knows you're here. The cafe door opened. Tony saw him instantly. Victor Hale walked in calmly, dressed like any early morning businessman. No guards visible, which meant they were already surrounded. Tony's pulse slowed. Danger sharpened his focus. Victor smiled faintly as he approached their table. You always were difficult to replace, he said, lips moving clearly enough for Tony to read. Peter's hand moved subtly toward his weapon. Victor raised both hands slightly. No violence, he said. Too public. Tony spoke, voice uneven but firm. You frame me. Victor tilted his head. I redirected suspicion, he corrected calmly. You were expendable. The words landed without emotion. Just business. Tony's hands trembled slightly. Anger? Betrayal? Years of manipulation crystallizing into clarity. Upload. 79%. Victor's eyes flicked to the laptop. You really think exposure protects you? He asked. These systems survive scandals. Tony met his gaze. Yes, because sunlight destroyed secrecy. Victor sighed almost regretfully. You could have ruled this world beside me. Tony shook his head. No more. Peter watched the exchange carefully, realization dawning. Tony wasn't afraid anymore. He was done running. Upload. 91%. Victor's calm expression finally cracked slightly. You're making a mistake. Tony reached forward and pressed enter. Upload 100%. Across the world, files released simultaneously. Journalists received data dumps. Authorities triggered alerts. Financial crimes units lit up with automatic reports. The syndicate's hidden structure exploded into public view. Victor's phone buzzed repeatedly. He stared at the screen. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Peter stood slowly, badge appearing in his hand. Victor Hale, he said clearly. You're under arrest. Sirens approached outside, real law enforcement this time, drawn by automated federal alerts Tony had embedded into the release. Victor looked at Tony one last time. You chose chaos. Tony answered quietly. I choose freedom. As agents flooded the cafe minutes later, Peter stepped back, watching Tony carefully. The war wasn't fully over, but the balance had changed. Irreversibly. Tony exhaled slowly, tension leaving his body in waves. For the first time since he was 18, he wasn't hiding. Chapter 14. After the fall. The rain started softly, misting the empty street outside the motel. Tony noticed it immediately. Tiny ripples forming in puddles, reflections stretching and folding along the asphalt. He adjusted his jacket, watching the subtle movement. Sound never warned him. Vision did. Peter stirred beside him, still half asleep, eyes narrowing at the light outside. Tony watched his lips as he murmured, "Rain." The word came halting, unsure, but Tony could read it perfectly. "I see," Tony said, carefully shaping each syllable, his deaf accent rounding vowels and softening consonants. "Forecast, right?" Peter smiled, stretching slightly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He reached over and nudged Tony's hand. Tony felt the warmth and tension that had been coiled for weeks slowly begin to loosen. "Breakfast?" Peter asked, voice low but audible. Tony could hear the cadence, but more importantly, he watched the subtle movement of Peter's lips. Tony shook his head. "Later. Neat plan." He signed carefully, fingers precise, making sure Peter could read without effort. "We stay cautious. Still danger." Peter's expression hardened slightly. He knew, even after the mastermind's public exposure, remnants of the syndicate could still be watching. Tony's life had never been quiet, and it wouldn't be now. He stepped closer and brushed a hand over Tony's shoulder. "Yeah," Peter agreed. "We can't let our guard down yet." Tony nodded once, a small but deliberate motion. Then he took a deep breath and let the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. For once, danger wasn't immediate. It was a background hum, enough to remind them but not enough to paralyze. Peter leaned down and signed slowly, deliberately, "You saved me." Again. Tony felt a strange warmth in his chest. He responded verbally, careful with every word. "We saved each other." The accent softened the edges of the sentence, but Peter understood perfectly. Peter's eyes softened, searching Tony's face. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Tony hesitated. For decades, he had survived alone, kept people at arm's length, never trusting anyone. But now, standing here in a quiet moment after chaos, he realized he didn't want to imagine a life without Peter. "I'm not alone now," he admitted, words imperfect but honest. "I want to stay with you." Peter smiled, a little shaky, as if the weight of months of danger and secrecy had finally lifted just enough to allow relief. He reached over and held Tony's hand, fingers intertwining naturally. Tony looked down at their hands, the simple connection feeling profound. For years, touch had been a luxury. Now it was grounding, confirming that the world hadn't entirely abandoned him. Peter leaned closer, just enough to feel Tony's breath against his cheek. "Then we figure it out together," he whispered. "Whatever comes next, we face it as a team." Tony's lips curved faintly, and he signed slowly, deliberately. Together. They stayed like that for a long moment, shoulders brushing, hands locked. Outside, the rain fell steadily, washing the streets clean, reflecting the soft lights of the motel and the world beyond. Tony's eyes flicked to the door occasionally. Old habits die hard, but he felt something new, a fragile sense of security. Finally, Peter pulled back just slightly, enough to look Tony in the eyes. "You know," he said with a teasing grin, "we might actually survive this yet." Tony let a soft laugh escape, the sound rough and uneven but sincere. "Maybe survive together," he echoed, accent lingering but warmth clear. Peter leaned back, watching him, and Tony realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the constant pull of danger pressing on his chest. He still had enemies, still had a world that wouldn't leave him alone. But for this night, for this small slice of time, he had Peter. And that, he thought, might just be enough. Chapter 15, The Final Reckoning. The city had not yet woken, but danger never slept. Tony crouched behind the hood of a black SUV, eyes scanning the deserted alleyway. Across the street, headlights glinted off metal. Romano crew operatives, desperate and cornered. With Victor Hale apprehended months ago, the syndicate's remaining muscle had grown reckless. Tony had anticipated this. Peter moved beside him, gun drawn, lips silently forming words Tony could read. "Ready." Tony's hands tightened around his firearm. He signed quickly, I lead. You cover. Peter nodded. The partnership forged over months of trust and life-or-death situations was instinctive now. The first attacker charged, weapon raised. Tony fired 2 precise shots, dropping him before he could reach cover. Peter rolled left, picking off another with a clean headshot. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off dumpsters. Tony's reflexes, honed since childhood, allowed him to move silently between targets, each step calculated. Another 2 operatives tried to flank them from the right. Tony pivoted, firing twice, disabling one and forcing the other into the shadows. Peter covered Tony's movements, taking down 2 more as the last man hesitated, realizing the fight was over. We're clear. Temporarily, Peter whispered. Tony exhaled. His chest still tightened, adrenaline humming through every nerve. Almost safe, he said, accent thick but controlled. They regroup dangerous. Even with Victor gone, Romano crew remnants and other small syndicate factions were still active. The financial leak Tony had executed months ago had exposed hundreds of millions of dollars in hidden assets, and governments, law enforcement, and media were all reacting. Some of Romano's members had attempted to seize funds or cover tracks. Now, with law enforcement monitoring every move, they had nowhere to hide. Tony's encrypted laptop buzzed with notifications. Authorities had frozen the stolen money, redirecting accounts to legitimate victims. Banks flagged unusual transactions, tracing every last cent. Tony's own fortune remained secret, safely hidden behind layers of offshore structures and encrypted transfers. Peter glanced at him, eyes narrowing. Your career, this is going to bite you. Disobeying orders, assisting a criminal. Tony shook his head slowly, signing. I help stop many criminals. Save you. Save innocent people. Peter exhaled, tension fading slightly. Yeah, the Bureau might suspend me, maybe dock my pay, but the world sees what we did. They'll understand eventually. A flash of movement caught Tony's eye, Romano reinforcements attempting a last-ditch attack. Tony rolled, firing over Peter's shoulder, the shots precise, disabling 2 attackers before they could react. Peter took down another, and Tony's calculation forced the last 2 into retreat. Sirens now echoed in the distance. Real law enforcement, drawn by Tony's careful digital alerts, closing the net. The fight ended as quickly as it began. The city streets were quiet once again, drenched in early morning rain. Tony leaned against the SUV, chest heaving, watching Peter approach. We did it, Peter said softly. All of it. Exposed, secured, and done. Tony smiled faintly, voice uneven but warm. Yes, done, finally. He signed slowly, we together safe. Peter took his hand, thumb brushing over Tony's knuckles. And now, what happens next? Tony glanced at the skyline. The financial scandal had reached politicians, media outlets, and law enforcement worldwide. Romano crew arrested, stolen money accounted for, FBI internal leaks traced. The underworld was collapsing. Tony's lips curved into a rare, full smile. We leave, disappear. Start, new life. Peter leaned close, forehead touching his. I'll go anywhere with you. The rain slowed, leaving the city slick and glowing. For the first time, Tony didn't feel the constant pull of danger pressing on him. He had survived, exposed criminals, secured justice, and kept Peter safe. And now, he could finally consider a life not defined by fear. Tony exhaled slowly, voice soft but steady. We survive together. Peter smiled, fingers intertwined with his. Together. Above them, sirens approached, alerts flashing. The world would never know the full story. Not all the danger, not all the quiet bravery. But Tony didn't need it to. He had Peter. He had freedom. He had a choice. And that was more than enough. Epilogue: New Beginnings. The small coastal town smelled of salt and pine, a sharp contrast to the concrete, neon, and gunfire Tony had spent his life navigating. He stood on the porch of their new home, the wind tugging lightly at his hair, watching the waves curl and break against the rocks below. For the first time in decades, the world felt quiet, not silent because sound existed but safe. Peter emerged behind him, coffee in hand, offering a small smile. "You're staring again," he said, voice low and soft. Tony could read his lips perfectly, and the familiar cadence made the sound almost unnecessary. Tony allowed himself a small smile. "Looking a future. Safe, here." His words came slow, deliberate, accent shaped by a lifetime of carefully spoken speech. He signed anyway, brushing Peter's hand with his fingers. "Safe, together." Peter's grin widened. "Together," he echoed aloud, leaning close, letting their foreheads touch. "No guns, no syndicates, no surprises. Just us." Tony exhaled, the tension from years of danger and deception finally leaving his body. He remembered the first time he had met Peter, the quiet suspicion, the careful observation. Now, the trust they had built in silence, in sign language, in words, felt like armor stronger than any gun or strategy. Inside, the apartment was modest but warm. Boxes still lined the living room. Furniture had been acquired slowly, carefully, without drawing attention. Tony's wealth, though vast, remained hidden. It wasn't needed here. Security and peace were worth more than public acknowledgement, more than ostentation. Peter set the coffee down and watched Tony from across the room. "You ever think about court, reporters, all the chaos we left behind?" Tony shook his head slightly, fingers brushing the arm of the couch. "Past, done. Future, ours." Peter nodded. "Yeah, I get it." His fingers curled around Tony's in a silent gesture that spoke louder than words. "We start new." Months had passed since the final exposure of Victor Hale's empire. The Romano crew was dismantled, remnants arrested. The stolen money was accounted for, partially returned to victims, and partially frozen for restitution programs. The FBI leak had been traced to a low-level rogue agent. Systemic reforms prevented any repeat. Politicians implicated in minor financial improprieties faced scrutiny, but Tony had shielded his identity carefully. He remained anonymous, a ghost in the system. Peter, meanwhile, had faced temporary suspension for going off protocol. He had been grilled, investigated, and reprimanded. But the Bureau recognized the greater good. The syndicate's collapse had saved lives and prevented far greater crimes. He had been allowed to resign voluntarily, his record cleared in recognition of his bravery. Tony had watched every step, invisible, guiding from the shadows. It was rare that he allowed someone so completely into his life. Rarer still that he trusted them entirely. Peter had earned that trust with patience, respect, and unwavering courage. Now they had mornings like this, coffee in hand, waves breaking below, the sky a soft gray blue. Small things became monumental. Peter laughing at Tony's mispronunciations, Tony teaching Peter new signs in the quiet of the living room, cooking together, planning the life they had only ever dared to imagine. Tony rested his head lightly against Peter's shoulder, eyes closing for a moment. "Home, real home." Peter tightened his embrace. "You earned it," he whispered. "We earned it." Tony opened his eyes, lips curling faintly. "We safe. Together." And truly they were. The constant danger, the secret calculations, the ever-present threat of betrayal all gone. Only the trust they had forged remained, solid and unshakable. They stepped out onto the porch again, hands entwined, watching the horizon. The sun was beginning to rise, spilling light across the ocean. It wasn't just morning. It was a beginning, a life built on choice, love, and hard-earned peace. Tony smiled at Peter, voice soft but certain. "Future ours." Peter kissed him lightly, tender, a seal on years of struggle, danger, and survival. "Ours," he echoed. For the first time, Tony Royce didn't have to fight to survive. For the first time, he could simply live and love freely. And together, they stepped into that future,